Hello, everybody. It's me, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. Hello, everybody. It's me, Timms, Vicky, the White Zulu, the she-elephant, the matriarch. You know who I am. Anyway, this week, we've got an extra special piece called Meet the In-Laws. So I'll start right away. Durban, 1969, Part 8, Meet the In-Laws. The next decision to be made was my bridesmaids. During my last 2 years at St. Anne's discussing boys, as we all did most of the time, the conversation invariably turned to weddings and whom we'd choose as bridesmaids. Naturally, we fantasized, planning our dream weddings down to the last detail, and there were always huge imaginary affairs. We'd say warmly to our closest friends, and of course you 4, or even 6, will be my bridesmaids. I was the first one in the class to get engaged, so I was about to ring my 4 best friends and ask them. But Mum got in first. We were up for the weekend again. Fred was fishing, and I was closeted with the wedding planner from hell. I'd like to ring Mary, Lynn, Pam and Sue, I said. What for? She asked. To be my maid of honour and bridesmaids, I said casually. Certainly not, was the curt reply. You'll have your sisters as bridesmaids. My jaw dropped. Delia was in England at a finishing school. Otherwise I might have asked her. But my 2 older sisters were already married, and Nicolette was the mother of 2 little boys. But Diana had 2 girls from her class as well as Delia and me, I protested. She asked them before she asked me, or I would have put a stop to it, she snapped. You'll have your sisters as bridesmaids, and that's that. Another one of my dreams had flown out of the window. Again, I was bitterly disappointed and decided to try a different tack. Mum, can I at least make 1 or 2 decisions? After all, it is my wedding. I won't have you arguing with me on any of these matters, she said, and went off to check on her garden girls. Later that morning, just before the moment when the kitchen clock struck 12, and Mackay brought the obligatory silver tray, complete with silver ice bucket, matching tongs, a little silver dish of lemon slices, and 3 crystal glasses onto the front veranda for gin and tonic time, Mum stuck her head out of the sitting room door. I was on the front veranda, curled up in one of the white armchairs, reading. "Your father wants to see you in the office," she said abruptly. "Now." I felt a jolt of shock. What had I done wrong now, I wondered. It always struck a chill into our hearts whenever Dad summoned us to the office. Occasionally, if we'd done something either of them considered wrong, he came into the room we were sitting in, stood in front of whoever was in trouble that particular day, and reprimanded us briefly before walking away. To be summoned to his office for a one-on-one discussion was, for the most serious crimes. With a sinking feeling, I walked through the sitting room and pushed open the office door. Dad was sitting at his desk. He swiveled around in his big wooden office chair and stared at me coldly. I stood there silently, waiting. "I'm paying for this bloody expensive wedding, and you'll do as your mother says," he said curtly. "I will not have you arguing with her over any of her decisions." I looked at the floor and nodded. He turned briskly back to his desk and resumed his paperwork. I was being dismissed. Dad absolutely hated being dragged into any potential disputes between Mum and us. He preferred to be left in peace and well out of any discussions, particularly wedding plans. Mum made all the decisions, but if we argued, she'd immediately call in the big guns, and Dad was enlisted to end any further debate. His word was law in our family, the bottom line always being, "As long as you're under my roof, you'll do as I say. If you don't like it, you can always leave." His other mantra was, "If you don't like it, I'll cut you off without a penny." Like a Victorian father in charge of a household full of women, or a dictator. We had no say, even in plans that directly affected us. Our only defense was to marry and get away from the farm as fast as possible to escape the tyranny. Both my older sisters had married as soon as they turned 20, and I was about to do exactly the same. I'd been lucky enough to have fallen in love with a wonderful man, and we were more than ready to marry. So it was good fortune for me, rather than any port in a storm, and just settle for anybody to get us out from under our parents' thumb, which was what at least one of my sisters, maybe two, had done. The only decision Dad made when it came to weddings was what kind of champagne to provide for the reception. Proper French champagne, not that South African stuff. "I don't want our friends to think I serve up Kaffir champagne at these weddings," was all he said. Mum decided my sisters should wear pale pink bridesmaids' dresses, identical to my wedding dress but sleeveless, and marched off to add them to her list for the dressmaker in Maritzburg. Now it was time to work out the guest list. She pulled out the same list that she made up for Diana's wedding. It was also her Christmas card list. Cousins, close friends of theirs, not ours, and one or two neighbouring farmers who were deemed suitable. "I have to greet them when I bump into them in Nottingham Road," she said. "It would be awkward if I don't invite them." She asked Fred to ring his parents and get his mum to send her, via airmail, a list of the people they wanted to invite. Obviously, it would be too far for them to travel out from Scotland and England to attend the wedding, but correct procedure dictated they must be invited. There would be 300 guests in total, as she ticked off the last name on her list. As she ticked off the last name on her list, I asked, "What about my friends?" "What friends?" She wasn't really listening now and busy scribbling down the correct wording for the printers, copying them from Diana's wedding invitation, which she'd saved. She'd used the same printers in Maritzburg again. They could be trusted to do them correctly. And she most certainly wasn't going to trust me with such an important job, as I'd already messed up the engagement announcement. "My school friends, the girls I was to have as bridesmaids," I said in dismay. "Oh, God," she said. She raised her eyes heavenwards. "You should have mentioned them earlier. I've got a full list now of 300 definite guests, excluding the Mackay James lot, and we can't invite any more. And the people I work with. They were all thrilled for me when I got engaged to Fred, and will expect to be invited." She flew into a rage. "Jesus Christ," she threw the list down onto the table. "I don't know what I'm going to do now." Then, ungraciously, "I'll have to cross 6 people off my list, and you can have 4 friends and 2 office people." Even though I had 3 bosses, the owners and directors of the chartered accounting company Silburn, Castleton and Joubert, and would now have to choose one of whom to insult, after which she had stormed out to the garden. I'd scored a very small victory. The invitations were printed in the best possible taste, embossed on thick ivory paper. The wording was carefully correct, and the print in black copperplate. No gold or silver, and God forbid, no wedding bells, doves, or cupids. "So common," she sniffed. "I hate all those vulgar additions." She gave Fred a parcel of 50 invitations to post to his mother, Bar, at Glencruton Castle, from where she'd addressed them to post on to her guests over there. Fred was working out of town supervising the building of Pier Number 2, and my office was very close to the main Durban post office. So it made sense that he asked me to take the parcel in on Monday. It was always hectic on my switchboard on Mondays, and I had to work through my lunch hour, so I gave the parcel to our Zulu messenger. It was his job to go to the post office twice a day to post or collect mail and buy stamps for the office. I marked the parcel airmail in big black letters, put lots of airmail stickers on them, and sent him off with 40 rand. It should have been more than enough to cover the cost of postage. "Make sure it goes to airmail and not surface," I told him firmly in Zulu. "Yebo, missus." He put on his cap and off he went, arriving back later with a slip, which I put in my desk drawer. "Was it enough money?" I asked. "Yebo, missus." He nodded vigorously. "Here's your change." And he handed me a couple of coins and 2 or 3 rand notes. The date of our wedding drew nearer and nearer, and the Scottish invitations still hadn't arrived. There were frantic phone calls between Mum and Ba. "No sign of them yet," she said. Dad rang me, always a bad sign. He'd now been goaded into grilling me just how I'd sent the parcel. And I had to own up that I'd delegated my job to Sipho, the messenger. "Are you mad? You should have taken that parcel to the post office yourself," he raged. "But we trust him. He takes enormous sums of cash to the receiver of revenue every single day for us, and we've never, ever had any problems with him." I protested feebly, but not so convinced now. I'd been worrying a little bit about this parcel's non-arrival too. He's very reliable and we give him all sorts of vital and valuable stuff to post. He's never let us down. You can never trust a Mont, Dad slammed the phone down. Clearly, I'd messed up again. I'd been given only 2 jobs to do for my wedding preparations, and I'd screwed up both of them. A few weeks after the wedding, the parcel arrived at Glencruton. Our trusted messenger had pulled off the stickers, crossed out my instructions, sent it surface mail, and pocketed the lion's share of the cash. What's new? Both my sisters were fed up with this wedding. They didn't particularly like me, especially as I'd managed to acquire a fiancé whom my parents fawned over, while treating their own husbands with indifference. And they hated the pink dresses Mum chose for them out of the pattern book, and as an additional insult, she'd insisted they each buy a pair of white satin bridal shoes and, at their own expense and inconvenience, go off and get them dyed pink by professional dyers. I'm never going to wear them again. They're awful. One of them rang me at work to moan. They couldn't complain to Mum as they'd get short shrift, so they took it out on me. My wedding dress was ready for the first fitting, and I drove up the N3 to Maritzburg in my second-hand green 1964 Mini Minor, a birthday gift from Dad before he knew I was so involved with Fred, and was furious when I became engaged shortly thereafter to a man who had his own car, to meet Mum at the dressmaker's rooms. I put it on and looked at myself in the long mirror in utter dismay. It was simple, all right, with an empire line, severe-looking high mandarin collar, and long sleeves, with cuffs. It was a dress an Amish woman would have approved of, right down to the small buttons covered in the same plain white material as the dress. I looked like Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The clinical look was completed by a plain white band to hold the veil in place on my head. Even Mrs. Van Tonder had misgivings and moved around me to suck on a back tooth, doing her best to be diplomatic. Ach, shame, Mrs. Ross. It looks just too plain now. Can't we just put a little something here? And she held up a strip of modest white braid against the dress. Grudgingly agreed to allow a modicum of trim, but it did very little to soften the ward matron effect. I was crushed with disappointment by the austerity of my wedding dress. I'd so badly wanted the fairy tale, frothy, Cinderella at the ball kind of dress, but there was no point in making a fuss. So I stared at the floor and bit on my bottom lip, swallowing hard to try and dislodge the lump in my throat. Mrs. Van also managed to persuade Mum to relent and add a length of braid to the otherwise unadorned and very homemade-looking pale pink sleeveless bridesmaid dresses, which might mollify my sisters a little, but I doubted it. As Fred told his mother, Bar, about our plans in his weekly phone calls to her, she began to backpedal on her initial refusal to degrade herself enough to attend a colonial wedding. Well, darling, I think we might be able to make the time to fly out for the wedding after all, she said. And eventually, albeit still reluctantly, she booked a first-class flight for them, both to Johannesburg, to arrive a week before the big day. They arrived in early October. Diana and her husband John had offered to fetch them from Johannesburg Airport, where they now lived, and invite them home for drinks at their little flat before taking them to their hotel for the night. My future in-laws would be catching their connecting flight down to us in Durban the following day. I was very grateful for this kind deed, and later on that evening I rang Diana after they'd dropped Bar and Bob off. "What are they like?" I asked. There was a long silence, and then, "I don't quite know how to say this," she said, and she hesitated again. "All I can say is they're a bit odd." "How do you mean odd?" I asked. "I think the flight must have affected them, as they seemed, I don't quite know how to say this actually, or tactfully, very drunk," she said cautiously. "I can't describe it any better than that." I digested this bit of information, thanked her for looking after them, and hung up. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.